Welcome to the Unit Economics Podcast. I'm Josh Stabinsky. On today's episode, I sit down with Joe Hollier, co-founder of Light, the company behind the Light phone, a minimalist mobile device designed to be used as little as possible. We talk about how the company emerged from an experimental Google design program, why Joe and his co-founder chose to build hardware in a software-dominated world, and what it actually takes to bring a new phone to market without relying on the traditional venture-backed smartphone playbook. We get into crowdfunding as early validation, how they managed to develop a relationship with Foxconn, one of the world's largest manufacturers of electronics, and what that partnership required at their scale. We discuss the trade-offs between feature decisions, why the phone includes essentials like calling, texting, directions, and now a camera, but will never include features like social media access, email, or an internet browser, and how those boundaries shape both the product and the business model. This was an incredibly thoughtful, detailed look at what it takes to build a hardware company with a fundamentally different incentive structure. I learned so much from my conversation with Joe, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. If you don't mind just giving a brief background on yourself to start, that would be great.
Hey, yeah, my pleasure. My name is Joe Hollier. I grew up in New Jersey and live in Brooklyn. That's where I'm chatting with you today from. I grew up skateboarding. I went to school for graphic design here at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. I worked as a freelance artist and was really interested in film and fine art and all of these different things. But in 2014, I joined an experimental Google program, and that's sort of where this idea for the Light phone was born, an intentionally simple cell phone that we've been creating for the last 11 or so years.
Yeah, can you tell me more about what the program was like? My understanding is that's where you met Kai. So if you could, explain what that was like, that'd be great.
Yeah, so Google, I was pretty skeptical of Google, but they had this really open-ended sort of hypothesis that designers should be at the founding table of companies, or that companies that had a designer at the founding table were uniquely positioned in the industry. And so instead of being an afterthought, this kind of ribbon that you put on what the MBAs and the engineers come up with, that design is a fundamental aspect of making a product that has empathy and a brand that has culture and a vision and a sort of cohesiveness. And that resonated with me. I think I was intrigued by the premise of this Google program. So I decided to join. There's about 15 designers that they selected from around the world. Kaiwei, my co-founder, was one of those. People came from a mix of backgrounds, all sort of under the umbrella of design, but Kaiwei had just gotten a master's in human-centered design. Some people were more like UX. Some people were more like advertising background. And I think I was a little bit more of a wild card. The program itself started in September and ended in May. So it was about a school year long. It was called 30 weeks. And basically every day, every other day, we got the opportunity to chat with a founder, an investor, just kind of a thought leader in the tech space and learn how and why these different companies and brands were coming to be. They encouraged us then to come up with our own ideas for technology companies and through design to sort of visualize the dream so that then you could excite potential customers, potential partners, whether that's the engineers to help you build it or, financiers to come in and help you actually bring this thing to life. And that design could be used as a vehicle to then initiate companies through that power that is like visualization. So it was a great hypothesis.
Yeah, it's such a cool program. Do you know if it's still going on today, or is it just like a one-time experiment?
It was a mostly one-time experiment. After our year, they iterated for 2 half programs, but I think ultimately in the minds of Google, it did not prove to be successful because Light Phone is the only company that came out of there. And I think we were sort of the opposite of what they wanted, which was smartphone apps. We learned really quickly that they wanted us to make smartphone apps because smartphone apps, you could infinitely scale, you could get to an MVP really quickly. And me coming in and saying, I want to make this phone was kind of like, well, hardware is really hard. And, to make a phone to get off your phone at the time was, not the most interesting idea to Google. So I think they sort of saw it as a failed experiment in that regard.
Yeah, that's funny. It's sort of ironic, but a great story. So what kind of conversations were you having at the time? It sounds like the prompt was around software creation, but what was going on? What were you and Kaiwei talking about at that point that led you to the answer that you should start this company?
Yeah, I think like as we got to hear from these founders, a lot of times they started their project with a really like great intention. They had this idea, they had this need that they wanted to solve, but in the course of taking on VC funding, they found themselves now having to meet almost unrealistic growth expectations. And to achieve that, they found themselves, really hammering in on this KPI of retention. And this was across so many different types of software products. And retention is just how much time a user spends with your product. So they use the word sticky, because if you can make something sticky that people kept coming back to and spending hours a day, well, that was a real business to be had. And I think when I was reflecting on that and the conversations Kai and I had were around like, if we're just spending one more hour on some new app that we come up with, is that actually what any of us want? Or when I reflect and think about my phone usage, in the summer before I went on a road trip and lost my phone and went a few weeks without a phone, and it was like the best few weeks of my life. And I thought about this time as a freelancer when I was in Miami and I brought my phone to the beach to change a song. And then I saw an email from a client that bummed me out. And, these moments where I was like, why do I have the whole laptop with me all of the time when I have, two different computers at home? Maybe sometimes I just need a phone. And so that was sort of the hypothesis in a way. And I think, other sort of reflections that came in at the time were thinking about how when I grew up, there was one computer in the house that had the internet. I had to very intentionally go online. There was this clear distinction between online and offline. And as the smartphone infiltrated my life, there was no longer distinction. I might bring the phone with me to bed. I might bring it to the toilet, and basically every other moment in between in my life. And the hypothesis, the initial thing that we had for Light Phone was that we wanted to encourage people to intentionally go offline for some period of time. And we called that experience going light. And we thought that being so hyper connected all the time, that taking these intentional breaks by saying, for this afternoon, for this weekend, for this week even, I'm going to be light, allowed you to then focus on all of the other things that might matter in your life.
It's unbelievable how pervasive these devices have become. And the problem only seems to have gotten worse. So in my mind, you were somewhat early.
I would wholeheartedly agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So the program ends. Walk me through what happens between the program ending and the first light phone, because there's been 3 iterations of the light phone, I guess either being developed or, let's say, landing in consumers' hands. Like, let's walk through that whole process.
Yeah. So even like in the program, so I had this idea, it's early fall. The program's still at the beginning, and I'm starting to pitch it, and I'm getting a very polarizing reaction. And this is just me with a piece of plastic that I went to Canal Plastics and had them trace my credit card. So it looked like actually not too far off from what the first light phone looked like, but, no working prototype. And basically there was on one hand pitching this idea conceptually with some branding. I started using the word light, the light phone, and, starting to think of what the feature set might be, or rather lack of feature set might be. And then on the other hand, we actually started doing tests where we would give people flip phones for an evening or a weekend. We gave them 10 speed dials that they could write on paper ahead of time, and we made it so that their smartphone calls would forward to the flip phone. It wasn't a full circle thing. If someone texted them, they wouldn't see it, and if you called them, it'd be a random number. But what we realized in those tests was that almost everyone had a really positive experience to describe that time away. It was the most refreshing weekend I've had in months, and this and that. And the other side of it was that no one actually used the flip phone. It was this sort of peace of mind that it was there. God forbid you needed a call, or God forbid someone needed to call you. But actually the reason these people had such a great weekend wasn't because of our product doing anything. It was actually because our product was invisible and allowed them to then do all these other things. So that's sort of what gave us this philosophy, this design philosophy that we call design to be used as little as possible. And that was kind of our North Star. But, even then we had a piece of plastic and some good feedback, but no investor was going to give Kai and I the millions of dollars that we would need to bring a product like this to life based off just this initial kind of feedback. So we, right at the end of the program, and ended in May, we launched a Kickstarter campaign. We didn't really have, a huge list of names or any PR direction, it was really new to all of us, but we got really lucky that the idea resonated. And I think the polarization made it a really like conversation provoking thing. So, someone might post it on their Facebook and then people are commenting, that's the dumbest thing I ever had, or, oh my God, I think I need one. And, it led to a much deeper conversation than just like, does it have Bluetooth? It was much more about like what it means to be a father or a student or an artist and how we exist with technology. So the Kickstarter campaign was a success. We raised, I think, like $420,000 or something along those lines, which is not nearly enough money to make a phone, but it made a really big splash. We got an international press. And I think that was enough to then confidently go forward and start reaching out to these different partners that ended up working on the Light phone to start raising money and actually bringing this thing to life. So the Kickstarter really was the like turning point to this is a real thing. We've taken people's money and now we need to make this phone and deliver it.
Yeah. Before we get into the manufacturing process, what made you think there's something that needs to exist here beyond just a flip phone? If people had such a great reaction to using the flip phone in itself, what sort of gap specifically did you see that device wasn't able to solve for?
Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, there's like a branding and marketing gap, is that no flip phone is being positioned as a secondary phone. It felt like a market that wasn't tapped at all, that didn't exist. We had one phone, but when it comes to shoes or jackets, or for my case, cameras, I have different things for the right situation. If I'm going skateboarding, I'm going to wear these shoes. If I'm going in the snow, I'm going to wear those shoes. But yet when it came to phones, we had just one sort of solution. So I think that was really inspiring. And I think we realized that there was I don't know how to say this without sounding like almost pretentious, like there's kind of like a pride in going light. And we wanted the object to feel really new and special so that when someone goes, what is that? And you're like, I'm light right now. And to have that really represented. And actually, flip phones had way too many features. Clunky features. They're probably not nearly as sticky as their smartphone competitors. But at the end of the day, a lot of the flip phones started having web browsers and Twitter and games, and they just fundamentally weren't designed with this single purpose in mind. And we wanted to solve it in a holistic picture to make it so we could forward the calls and just really make it a seamless thing where like the flip phone way that we did it was kind of hacky. And so we were just kind of like, if we made it more seamless and promoted it, with this value proposition that, hey, we think if you take a break from time to time, you might find peace of mind in all these ways, and productivity and all these other great things that happen. But ultimately, like, yeah, marketing was like, branding was a huge part of it. Like no one was positioning is maybe a better word, a phone to do what we were doing at the time.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, let's talk about manufacturing. So my understanding is that you have partnered with Foxconn. Is that correct?
Yes. The first Light phone and the third Light phone were with Foxconn. We worked with a different manufacturer for the Light phone too. But basically, Kaiwei, talk about his background a little bit. He had an MBA and actually worked at a variety of phone companies in the 2000s, notably on the Motorola Razr project. Granted, it was him and hundreds of people on the project, but he had an understanding of cell phone manufacturing well beyond my naive, how hard can it be to make a simple phone? Kai, when we first met, really emphasized that it was not an easy task. He also speaks Mandarin and had a little bit familiarity. So Kaiwei actually went to Shenzhen and started talking to different factories. And we probably spoke with 2 to 3 dozen different factories. And I think what we found was some factories were really willing to do the product, but our confidence that they would actually deliver on anything close to what we had in mind, I think they were just kind of saying yes to bring in a new customer. And then a lot of the other clients or manufacturing partners that seemed capable felt we were way too small and way too niche, and it was too risky to take on, because for them, if they just only get through the NRE, that's the engineering process, and then once we hit production, we do one run and then we're out of business, it wasn't really worth it to them. And we got really lucky that Foxconn, being almost the biggest, maybe it is the biggest, I think, one of the VPs there in one specific department resonated so deeply with the idea that we were pitching. He felt, email is ruining my life. My kids aren't looking at me at the dinner table. And he's like, there's a potential market for second phones for all phones. And they were seeing at this time iPhones, still by far the most popular phone, but even they were starting to plateau in different ways. So I think we got really lucky that we got this connection and they were willing to take on our project.
It's incredible. It's amazing to me how in so many of these conversations I've had, there's one particular moment, a couple particular moments, one particular person who everything hinges on them being in the right place at the right time, right? If it weren't for this specific person being at the company, like who knows if this even would have been, the reality.
I definitely have thought that exact thing before many times. I could think of dozens of people that have crossed our path or moments. Yeah.
Yeah. As you've introduced new series of light phones, can you just explain to listeners briefly what features you added with each subsequent phone? Because
Yeah,
I'd
totally.
love to get into the balancing act of what's too much, what's not enough. How do you weigh what to add, what not to add? How much user feedback are you incorporating into this process? And yeah, what does that all look like?
No, that's my favorite stuff to talk about. So great. So maybe to give a little backstory, the original light phone itself was never positioned as a replacement to the smartphone. We called it your phone away from phone. So similar to my old internet analogy, we saw it like an away message. You leave your smartphone at home, you're going out for the evening, call me if you need me, and then you'd come back to your smartphone. And in being designed to be used as little as possible, that meant we limited it to only phone calls, and you could only store 9 speed dials. So there was no texting, no alarm. It was, in our mind, truest, simplest possible phone. And for these given moments, that was enough. As we started shipping that phone, that was early 2017, about 18 months after the Kickstarter, people started using the phone and we saw it actually working in a lot of really great ways. And I think on one hand, there was users like me that were like, well, I'm enjoying not having a smartphone so much. I don't want to go back to my smartphone, but without a full contact book, without even being able to get a text from your bank, it's a lot harder, And I think there was one anecdote that I really like where this couple, they both got their new light phones. They're a little bit older than us. They went on a date and the wife was like, it felt like we were like 30 years younger. Like it just, everything felt different. Just like my husband wasn't checking his email the whole time and I didn't have to bug him about that. But then at the end of it, when they might have called an Uber, they found themselves outside and they got in an argument about where to find a yellow car. And it took 10 minutes for them to find a yellow car. So they had this amazing evening and then it kind of got overshadowed by this frustration with Uber. And Kai and I kind of said, well, if they could have called an Uber, would that have taken away from the whole experience? And that really opened up our mind of seeing the phone as a sort of utility device. And we said, what kind of things could we add to the light phone, not to take away from the ethos, but to make it so that it could potentially replace your smartphone or at least take much larger chunks of your time. So you're not always on a smartphone so much. And we started, kind of going piece by piece through phones and being like, well, an alarm, that's kind of cool. Having a calendar, well, I've never checked my calendar because I was bored. Some of these things are just so utilitarian that you're like, well, that's a nice to have. And so when we went into the Light Phone 2, we sort of said, okay, we're going to build this around a customizable toolbox because the 5 things that I might find essential are different than the 5 things Kai finds essential, and they're going to be different than maybe everyone else's things. So we like this idea of customizable, but then, at a certain point, we had to draw some lines and say, what will the Light Phone never have? And, we sort of set out to say, like, it will never have an internet browser, it will never have social media, it will never have news, it will never have email. And our thinking was like, it's nothing infinite. It's nothing that you want to check and recheck. But similar to the Light Phone 1, we also did a crowdfunding campaign. So we had all of these users that were really excited about the premise of this kind of like Swiss Army knife phone that we were going for. And we were able to use them as a community to do tons of surveys. There would be discussions in the like internal forums through the Kickstarter platform about, no, that doesn't make sense on a light phone, or I think it should have this. And it was so incredible to see, and not everyone agreed. But I think we kind of came to the senses that like, the Light Phone can have all of these utility, but it will never have that. And we feel really confident that it will be a device that you're not being distracted by. And then obviously now we have a Light Phone 3 to sort of jump forward. And it's a lot of the same features as the Light Phone 2, but we just sort of made it more performant, more international. It's got a bigger screen, which is more practical for things like directions or group threads or long text. So it really tries to be a professional utility phone, almost like a true competitor to the smartphone. And then the latest feature that we added, other than a flashlight, which is awesome, is a camera.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like the main new feature of the Light Phone 3 is the addition of a camera. And I think I was really hesitant in Light Phone 2 era to think of a camera because I saw so many people go to these, go to the Eiffel Tower. They've wanted to go there their whole life. And then they take a picture and they're immediately now looking at
Yeah.
their phone, posting it, waiting for the dopamine. And they didn't actually sit with the Eiffel Tower at all. And I really didn't want that. Contrary, we saw an insane wave of protest here in the US in 2020. And there became a real need for having a camera to document for one's own safety. And there was all these other utilitarian moments of like, can you shoot me a photo of what it looks like? Okay, get the one on the left. I like that more. There's like not just social sharing. There's like actual utility in the camera. So I think the combination of those, we said, okay, we're going to introduce a camera, but we're going to try to do it our way. So for the Light Phone 3, the camera has its own like dedicated shutter button. And that's how you'd open the camera up. That's how you take a photo. And I think we are self-aware enough to know that we're not going to compete head to head with Apple or any of these other flagship smartphones on image quality processing. But we said if we can make it a really fun, nostalgic, flat, kind of old school, raw image, that will stand out in another way to the iPhone. And, I still have all of my other cameras from like my art practice, but it's really nice when I see a skate spot. I'm a big skateboarder to be like, hey, Dylan, I think you should try this. So I love that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the introduction of the camera, I have to imagine that the cost to produce the phone went up pretty substantially. I'm curious now in 2026 how you think about pricing, how your thoughts around pricing have maybe evolved over time. And at one point, I believe you had mentioned I listened to a different interview of yours where you had mentioned that you were breaking even, and this is probably a year or two ago maybe. And I'm curious what you can share around like per unit costs and how that's evolved over time, what the unit economics actually look like, what the most expensive components are. Any amount of information you can share would be great. And I know this can be kind of a sensitive topic, but I think the price point is such a particularly interesting aspect of this conversation. So yeah, anything you could share would be great.
Definitely. I probably can't be as 100% transparent as I'd love to be, but yeah, the Light Phone 3 definitely costs way more than the Light Phone 2, and the original Light Phone, we like kind of lost money on each unit at different points because we just never imagined that it could cost that much to make a phone. And I think that's one of my biggest learnings in this is that like in the Google program, I'd pitched this phone and I was like, for $20, you're going to get a Light Phone. And then I very quickly realized that was a completely naive number to begin with. There's obviously this hardware cost. That's the most obvious, our BOM. That's the bill of materials and everything that goes into it. Of that, the most expensive components are often the screen and the computer chip, the CPU. The Light Phone 3 has this metal casing and, everything's customized. And to get the buttons the way we want, we went a CNC route, and all of these little premium touches do cost money. And that is like a hard price that's actually constantly going up. We haven't quite hit economy of scale, but in recent years, things like tariffs have wreaked absolute havoc on our costs. But also, like right now, there's a memory shortage going on because AI data centers are buying memory up. And so as a small player, people are kind of ignoring our small requests for memory, or we're just having to pay an insane premium price. So we're seeing our BOM kind of constantly rise. But in terms of like what we calculate in the price of a Light Phone, I think something that's not as obvious is that the software, specifically tools like directions, voice to text, and directory, we actually pay per use every time a user uses it so that way we can provide that privately. When you get it for free on a smartphone, the company's gladly giving you their Google Maps or whatever the app is because the data that you're providing them is incredibly lucrative, and that's how they're making their money. So for us, user privacy is kind of one of our core principles. We could never build Google Maps ourselves with our, few person developer team that we've had most of the time. So we partnered with a company and we like them, but it costs money. And so this is a cost that we sort of space out over the lifetime of a phone. And I think we're also looking at the fact that we don't want you to get a new phone quickly. And especially with the Light Phone 3, we decided to add a replaceable battery door. Kind of hard to see, but there's 4 screws on the back so that a user could replace a battery because batteries inevitably start to degrade after about 3.5 years. So if that can extend the life another 3.5 years, another 3.5 years, hopefully this phone could last 5-10 years. We sort of have to then account for all of the software investment and these different tools over the years. So I think all of those things are kind of combined in the price of a light phone, but I'd be the first to tell you that I wish we could sell it for half the price. It's just not realistic. Like, I think that's what I'm always pushing for internally. And then Kai is more often the voice of reason and practicality of looking at the bottom line and what we need to survive, and especially at our scale. But we're all agreed that we want it so that if you're ready to go light, the cost isn't a hurdle. One really great factor of that is that you can get a really cheap phone plan for the light phone that can significantly offset some of the cost.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up. So you introduced cellular plans, I think somewhat recently. Can you walk me through the introduction of the cellular plan? Again, how you thought about pricing. How much did you know about cell networks when you started, when you started talking about this, I guess? And what benefits did you see to introducing a cellular plan for both you and for the customer? Because I do feel like there's this mutually beneficial aspect there.
That is what we hope. I think for the customer, it's mostly about a seamlessness, like being able to guarantee compatibility, not overcharging for more bells and whistles than you actually need on the light phone. And the fact that like consumers tend to dread and not trust carriers. So to try to build this holistic, full package that we could have for the customer, I think being that we have this crowd-funded route, this crowdsourcing routes, I think a lot of customers use our plan because they like supporting us. So it became another way, and it really does support us because as I was sort of speaking of how we have this kind of drain of paying for everyone's directions ongoing, some of the revenue from the service side does help that. And, as we're trying to realistically raise money and stuff like that, these things become really important, having a recurring model in addition to just a one-time sale. And we don't want to just start charging for features that we used to promote for free. So this felt like a very organic way because no matter what, you're going to have to pay for cell service. So if you're going to pay, why pay Verizon if you actually like us? And then we can invest that money into hiring more developers and making the phone a better experience. So we saw it as trying to be a kind of like full cycle thing. I knew almost nothing, maybe as little as one could possibly know about cell carriers, but in reality, there's only 3 phone companies in the US that own all the antennas, and that's the towers, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, and every other carrier is just renting from them, light phone included. There's a lot of regulations, taxes changed by zip code basis and all of this stuff, but we work with middleman partners to sort of facilitate a lot of that. So it's not terribly hard to start what they call a mobile virtual network operator, an MVNO.
Are you comfortable sharing how many or what percent of your customers are opting into your network?
Yeah. Historically, it's been about 25%. I haven't refreshed it up to date with Light Phone 3, but yeah, it's usually about a quarter, which to us was actually higher adoption than we anticipated. Because so often people, I think, are just like, well, I got this SIM card. Let me just pop it in the Light Phone. I do not want to have to call Verizon ever. Which makes sense. Or, maybe they're going to try the light phone. They're not 100% sure they're going to commit to it long term. And then maybe they might switch down the road.
Yeah. So what are the primary use cases or, I guess, user personas that you've seen using your phones? Some that come to mind for me would be people who just want to leave their smartphone at home, people who want to use this as their primary phone and don't actually want a smartphone. Do you see teenagers using the phone, parents who don't want their kids to have access to social media and everything that comes along with a smartphone? And I know this is a bit of a long-winded question. As more and more smartphones have moved to eSIM, how have you navigated that change? Like, to pop a SIM card out is not really a thing anymore. And so I'm curious how you've tried to combat that sort of friction point.
Yeah, that has definitely been a newer friction ever since the iPhone started making SIMless or like physical SIMs kind of extinct from their phones. But in terms of how people fit the light phone into their life, I think we kind of always kind of leave it up to the user and say, this is an unlocked phone. And I think you kind of nailed it. Like, there's a lot of people, the majority of our users do use it as their primary device. And that's not to say that I don't have a laptop that I also use, or maybe a tablet. And some people even keep their old iPhone just like on Wi-Fi. The light phone has a hotspot. So like maybe they'll bring it in their bag. They think they might need something more and they can, really quickly hotspot. But that friction is enough to make sure they're not just like doom scrolling while they're talking with their friend. There's definitely a subset of people that kind of have a 2-phone balance going between the 2 phones, but eSIM has made that more difficult. But there are some new cell phone features that are coming out, or carrier side features, I should say, to allow you to have 2 SIMs that mirror the same number. And that's something that the carrier is able to do. Hey, there's a call coming, ring both of these phones. So that's sort of kind of offset that. And then a new trend I've seen is people actually having 2 unique phone numbers and loving that, like a home phone and a work phone. Early on, I saw a lot of this with like European users who are less tied their identity to one phone number. I think maybe it's more common to switch numbers there, where in the US, people are like, I got this number in 9th grade and I'm going to have it till I die. Kind of like my number is my social security number or something. But for a lot of freelancers, I think they like this work phone, home phone balance where they're like, I have, my tattoo gun and all of the kit, and in that is my smartphone. And when I go to work, I can social media post about the work I'm doing. I can do the Venmo and Square app and all these other things, answer emails. But then on the weekend, I don't want random clients texting me. And, some people set up different. You could like forward calls if you wanted, but separating that, like, just because I'm freelance doesn't mean I'm available 24/7. And so it gives them that kind of clean distinction that they're looking for. And you're totally right. There are a subset of parents that get it as like a kind of kid's first phone, or maybe a kid's punishment phone if they're a little bit older and their grades start declining or something, as a kind of stepping stone of, yes, we obviously want you to have the peace of mind that you can reach us, God forbid,
Right.
but there's a million reasons why you might not want to give a child a smartphone with a camera and access to strangers all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. How have you thought about inventory management? I know you crowdfunded initially, but in the world of the Light Phone 3, have you been building to order, or have you run into any instances, I guess at any point during the company's history, where you just had excess supply or excess demand? Yeah, in either direction.
We have never had excess supply, which sounds like a really good problem, but I would say that production and forecasting as a small hardware company is probably our number one challenge historically. I'd say there's been a handful of months total, if ever, that we've had phones in stock for immediate purchase. The vast majority of our existence has been pre-order. And that's not to say that like we want to make them to order, but it's the reality of the down payments that are required and the long lead times for some of these components. Our screen manufacturer and CPU manufacturer, also the most expensive parts, might be upwards of like 4 to 6 months sometimes that you'd have to place an order before you get there. And that order being the most expensive thing, even if it's just a deposit, is, a huge chunk of money for a small team when you're not going to be able to sell that phone for months. So pre-ordering has helped us bridge that gap. But then it requires a lot of patience. And at times when we've missed that, which has happened many times over through delays out of our control often, but, obviously we're responsible for that. It's soured relationships with users where they cancel before they ever got to try the product. And I think that breaks Kai and I a little bit, because you're just like, no, you were so ready and we were so ready to help you, and we
Yeah.
just couldn't get the product delivered. Usually we're lucky that we're able to get some financing, inventory financing, which is like a traditional loan with pretty high aggressive interest rates. But then we can put down a deposit, get a lot of phones made, pre-order them in the meantime, and then have them, and sort of keep that cycle going. There's been really disruptive moments. Like we started to get in a good flow with that with the Light Phone 2, and then the pandemic hit 6 months after we launched. And that threw everything into chaos. And it was really hard to kind of get ahead of production then. And then sort of Light Phone 3, 2 weeks after launching, the trade war kicked off. And that really, again, set things into chaos. And the trade war even differently hit because we really struggled to find financing, traditional financing, because it was just so risky. Like, what if Donald Trump decides to say 200% tariffs tomorrow? That was just too much of a risk for these kind of traditional financing investors. We've been lucky to survive, and we're hoping to get ahead of inventory soon. But I'd say, like, we've always known that if we could just make enough phones, we feel that demand is there, which is a great feeling, but it feels crazy for almost years now at this point to not be able to, like, I'm like, we haven't even launched yet, it feels like, because even though we have almost 20,000 Light Phone 3s in the world, I know there's 20,000 more people that pre-ordered it that we haven't been able to deliver and have since canceled.
Yeah, it's such an interesting problem to find yourself in because I feel like the demand is only growing and will only continue to grow. I know that generally VC interest in hardware is very, very different than that of software.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
topic of fundraising came up a little bit earlier in the episode. And so I'm wondering what that's looked like to date. You've done a lot of crowdfunding, but what have conversations with traditional venture capitalists look like? And in pitching investors, how are you framing what you're trying to build? Because I'm wondering, are you pitching them on the idea that this is a relatively infinitely scalable problem, or is this a niche that will not be a massive, money-making machine the way the iPhone is? Like, how are you framing this when you're pitching to investors?
Totally. Great questions. And I think we have relied heavily on investment, especially when it comes to the NRE periods, these like non-recurring engineering costs, which are usually in the vein of about $4 million for each model. And to absorb that in our unit cost is almost impossible at our scale. I'm sure for Apples and the other likes, that's a much more reasonable thing. So we've relied heavily on private investment to help us get to new product development. And then we're usually able to sustain with some small financing and inventory financing and our fortunate stream of pre-orders that we've been lucky to have. Investment wise, we almost have no VC players, like maybe one or two small, technically VC firms, but it's mostly the vast majority, and it's over 90 plus individuals now are individual angel investors, some of which have never invested in tech before, some of which come from tech, either like, one of the co-founders of Twitter or the ex-president of Pinterest or the co-founder of Lyft. These are some of our investors. And I think a lot of our investors resonate on a very deep, like moral level with the company, but that's not enough to invest. And so there is this business case that we make, which is that there's 2 billion smartphones out in the world now, I think they say close to. And if we are just able to capture a fraction of this market, if, like I kind of use that analogy about shoes, like in so many other markets, there's diversity in product. But when it comes to smartphones, whether it's Samsung, Google, Apple, they're offering very similar thing, a giant glass rectangle that's going to use more or less the same third-party apps, more or less have the same 4 or 5 camera magic processing stuff. And we just feel like there's a really unique opportunity to build a different kind of technology brand. And so I think on one hand, there's a scale of phones and that very real possibility. But I think the large vision is that whether it's phones or any other products, like Light Phone's business model isn't predatory like so much of the technology world, of this kind of like, we're going to give it to you for free, but then there's all these hidden bells and whistles. And I really believe that the world is ready and people are willing to put their money into a brand that they trust and that is going to make things that they design with as much thought and intention and love as they can. And there's no sort of hidden doors, but yes, it might cost $699 for a simple phone, and you could get probably a smartphone subsidized for $300. But yeah, then it's going to read every one of your emails and you'll be tied to a 3-year contract with some carrier and these other things. So we just felt like the way that technology was going, that there'd be an inevitable pushback. And I think our investors believe that too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think you're right. I'm wondering, though, how you're getting the word out, because my understanding is that you're not really marketing or advertising at all. So how do you, beyond word of mouth, how do you get this message out?
I mean, word of mouth is definitely our biggest. And I think one thing that's we're really fortunate with phones is that people see your phone. And so like if you're going out to a diner and you put your phone on the table or someone sees you using it, it's an immediate conversation starter if you have a Light Phone, because people are like, what the heck is that thing? that's a phone, especially like the Light Phone 2 or the original iPhone, which really departed from like smartphone norms. And so often our users describe these conversations. They're like, I met this guy at the diner and we chatted for 3 hours about what it means to be a father and what Facebook is doing to this and how we feel about AI data centers, that. And, the conversations are way more than the Light Phone, but that really sets a thing. And I think in addition to that, like people that switch to the Light Phone, their friends and family and coworkers notice the changes. They're now taking these lessons and doing this, and they're more present and they're refreshed, and all of these positive things. They're like, well, gee, they're able to live with it. So they kind of lead by example in this really beautiful way. We've been really lucky with press ever since that first Kickstarter. TechCrunch covered it, and it was like a noticeable difference. The TechCrunch article, and then we were over our goal, email signups, and this whole thing. And I think because the Light Phone talks about technology in such a multifaceted way, whether like you're really concerned about privacy and data or the environment or children and what's happening to teens and kids. And, there's just so many angles that like we've been lucky to be covered in a variety of publications well beyond TechCrunch. And that's been huge for us. And then I guess like we are present on social media. As ironic as it is, we're not like terribly active, but we have a presence and people find it that way. And it's, great. And the irony is not lost on us, but it's also like, who else might want a Light Phone but someone that's been on Instagram for 3 hours and
Yeah.
then comes across our page and is like, yeah, I don't think this is working out what I'm doing here right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't know. I aspire to get out there louder and prouder one day, but money has been one real reality where I'm like, we could invest in marketing or we can invest in making the phone better. And I tend to always go for the latter and hope that by making a product that delivers on its promise and feeling like the problem is real enough that it will naturally sort of get there.
Yeah.
We've done a couple of campaigns that we were pretty proud of. And I think, we had a modest budget. So we're like, how can we be as clever as possible? And we did 2 wheat pasting campaigns. And then, they were out in the street, but like we didn't have like coverage. It wasn't like all of Brooklyn was covered. We had a couple here on this block, couple here, a couple there. Then we photographed it and like framed it into the story that can then be shared. So I don't know, trying to be clever and make the biggest bang for buck when you do have a little bit of money to spend.
What other brands do you draw inspiration from that are designing something to be used as little as possible, like you are, if any exist, or that are just simply going against the grain in their space in a pretty radical way, the way you are? Is there anybody that comes to mind?
Well, for the latter, I think Teenage Engineering is really cool.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar, but they make
Yeah.
a lot of these musical devices that are toy-like on one hand because they're just so fun and quirky and weird, but they're actually like very professionally musician oriented as well, and beautifully designed. So I've always found them to be really interesting and almost just like, how are you making that? Like, who is buying that? But like, there's enough weirdos out there, and that kind of gives me hope. Another company I like to call out just is like this company Arena. It's a software website where you can kind of image share and collect and reference in all of these ways, but they really built it as a tool that's super useful for designers. And they've been really transparent about their business model, and there's no ads and there's no ulterior motives. And so it's like this, it's not quite social media, but it's like, what if our software, instead of being free and then flipping that script to then need as much of our attention and data as possible, to be like, hey, we're going to make a tool that the users want to pay for because it gives them enough value. And it's a few bucks a month I pay for Arena, but it's worth it for me. And then they're able to sustain their operation. And I think, what if there was social media that looked in that way? So I think that's what Arena kind of inspires in me, is like, I like the idea of sharing photos with my friends. Like, I want to be using Instagram in that way, but right now the way it feels, it's like almost like a cesspool of noise and targeted and all
Yeah.
over the place. I don't even feel like sharing with my friends, but I'm like, I would gladly pay for a service that actually connected me with my friends with no strings attached.
It feels like such an obvious gap in the market that somebody's going to have to fill. So, and I also am a big fan of Teenage Engineering and would love to bring them on the show at some point. I don't have any of their products, but I think they're like just beautifully designed and it's such a cool company. What's something that you've changed your mind about since starting Light?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's full cold turkey 180s, but I've definitely, learned a lot. I think I could probably describe myself more as an idealist compared to Kai, and Kai will bring a sort of refreshing alternate perspective, as do all of our users. But I think like one of the biggest lessons I've learned about Lightphone is prior to Lightphone, I was like mostly freelance and I ran a little skateboard company, but I was kind of a one-man show. And I kind of thought that's how I worked best and was most effective. And I was totally happy with that. But I've learned the power of like having a co-founder and having a team and having people that have all these expertise that I severely lack at the table and what that can do. And, there's been many times that Kai and I have come with different perspectives and not agreed 100%. But then when we find a compromise, it's like way better than my initial idea or his initial idea. And like the power of that versus my sort of more stubborn design attitude before of like, no, this is what my gut says. This is the answer. I've made a lot of small mistakes, like, placing a button here. And then 3 months later, all the feedback in our surveys is that button is so annoying. I hit it all the time and we switch it. And like one time I switched up to the podcast player design, but I don't even really use the podcast player. And then all these people came with great feedback and you're just like, well, yeah, I was very wrong about that. So there's a lot of like subtle learnings I've had, but I wouldn't say there's like huge ones and any crazy drastic, like now I'm a born again Christian or something.
I think we have time for one more question. Where do you see Light 3 to 5 years from now? Do you see slowly improving upon the design of the phone? Do you see expanding into other gadgets that might also be pervasive in people's lives the way phones are? Or is this strictly a phone company and it's just a matter of iterating on the existing phone, one phone at a time?
I mean, I think when Kai and I built the brand Light, we did imagine it going well beyond phones, but the phone is just such a core object that every single person, it seems, has and is interacting with so often that it feels so relevant. And that's definitely been our biggest priority. And resource wise, I think we just are like all our chips in on trying to make the phone work as well as it can and to get these produced so that we really can reach an even more sustainable point of growth. And that's not to say like hyper growth. And we imagine more people having a light phone than a smartphone, but to get to a place where maybe we double our developer team, still quite a modest size, but then we can really be banging out new features. So I think slowly improving the product is probably the most important thing, but also just making the phone more accessible. I think we're finally now on the radar of some of these bigger carriers, and not that we love them, but if that working with them means that we can get the phone in more people's faces and for cheaper and just more readily available, I think, that's a really important thing to us too, is to not have this be some gate kept phone. It is always going to be a niche phone, but we don't want it to be like pretentiously niche. We have ideas we've discussed for other products, but we always find ourselves kind of having to reel back because we get pretty excited and there's a lot of work to do still on the light phone. But I think on the software side, there's so much room. And that's not to say, again, that we're going to become a smartphone with things, but like I get really excited about partnerships. Like, can we bring Lyft to the phone? And is there cool things we can do with them? Or on the music side, like I think NTS is really awesome. Can we get NTS on there and then maybe do some cool parties together that are more phone-free things? And I think you're just getting out there more. Feels like we've been sitting on our hands a bit the last few years resource-wise. And I think once we're able to really start growing, I'm excited to see where that conversation goes. We did a couple partnerships with schools. And that was really exciting, where like a whole school went to a light phone. So I'd love to see things like that. We just did a study with Stanford University. Some students actually initiated the study where they, gave some set of students a smartphone or kept their smartphone, some switched to a light phone, and sort of saw the results over a couple of periods. Part of me is like, well, could we get insurance companies to like subscribe you to the light phone for mental health purposes or something if we are able to prove it? So I think accessibility is just like trying to make it so this isn't a $6.99 kind of hyper niche designed product. would be awesome. But, it's not like there's a ton of new things for the phone. I could see us, continuing to iterate. The Light Phone 2 is no longer able to be sold in Europe because it's micro USB and they banned micro USB phones. So like we want to iterate that. So I think it's really just like jet fueled to the direction we're already going, but not in this kind of like VC hockey stick way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is such an important problem that you're trying to tackle. And yeah, I just can't wait to continue watching you grow, and I'm rooting for you all. So I just want to say thank you for what you're doing, and thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. I really appreciate it. If you want to share with listeners where they can find Light, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, we operate mostly through thelightphone.com. It's LIGHT, the same handle on Instagram and the other ones. But I'd say if you're curious, sign up for our newsletter. It's at the bottom. We send it sparingly. Really only when there's something significant to say. You're not going to get an email every Tuesday reminding you we exist. But if we have a really cool story or a sale, or if we actually finally have the phone in stock, we'll let you know.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Joe.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you can stay up to date with the latest episodes. Thanks for listening.